The year is 1905. The American century is beginning and steel is the undisputed king of commerce. But in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, a quiet crisis was unfolding. A crisis that proved the strongest metal on Earth was actually brittle. One company rose from the wreckage to engineer a rebellion, a single empire that forged the rival dynasties of Kenworth and Peterbilt. But the history books often miss the disturbing truth behind their survival. While competitors merged to save money, this company sanctioned a brutal civil war between its own brands. So grab a wrench, because we're going to dismantle the engine of American industry. Because one thing is for sure, you don't survive 120 years without a single bankruptcy by following the rules. You do it by breaking them. William Piggott Sr. did not view the Pacific Northwest through the lens of romance, but through the mechanics of friction and load. When he established the Seattle Car Manufacturing Company in 1905, he was responding to a singular, unforgiving truth: Eastern steel shatters in Western woods. Piggott understood that the rail equipment manufactured for the flat, predictable lines of the Atlantic coast was fundamentally brittle when pitted against the violent torque and inclines of Pacific logging operations. His mission was to engineer survival. The company focused on high-carbon steel wheels, reinforced logging bunks, and chassis capable of absorbing the torture of unpaved, precipitous grades. While the early facility was modest, the engineering philosophy was militant. Piggott demanded over-engineering as a baseline. Where standard wheels cracked under the crushing weight of old-growth Douglas fir, Seattle Car's wheels held. Their frames utilized cross-bracing, heavy enough to support uneven multi-ton loads without twisting. This was not refinement, it was fortification. The company prioritized field reliability over manufacturing ease, a decision that endeared them to the logging barons who measured downtime in lost fortunes. By 1917, the operation had outgrown its name. The reincorporation as Pacific Car and Foundry marked a pivotal evolution in industrial capacity. The inclusion of foundry was not merely semantic. It meant the company was no longer just assembling steel. They were pouring it. Control now extended from the scrap heap to the finished rivet. This vertical mastery allowed them to manipulate the metallurgy itself, tailoring alloy recipes to specific industrial abuses. The Great War turned the company's forge into an arsenal. The United States military did not ask for efficiency. They demanded volume and precision. Pacific Car's expertise in heavy steel fabrication made them an essential contractor for the war effort. This period of intense production acted as a crucible, burning away inefficiencies and installing rigorous quality control protocols that would survive long after the armistice was signed. Throughout the interwar years, Pacific Car did not dilute its focus. They dominated the heavy haul niche, serving the mining combines and timber giants who operated in the most hostile environments on the continent. When the Great Depression decimated the manufacturing sector, Pacific Car's overbuilt philosophy became its financial lifeboat. Customers with dwindling capital could not afford to replace cheap equipment. They paid the premium for Pacific Car hardware because they knew it would last decades. Financial conservatism and engineering excess became two sides of the same coin. But it was the Second World War that fully unleashed the company's potential. Pacific Car was no longer just a regional supplier, it was a titan of defense manufacturing. They produced landing craft, wing spars for Boeing's heavy bombers, and most notably, utilized their foundry expertise to cast massive, single-piece upper hulls for over 900 M4A1 Sherman tanks. The specialized welding and heavily assembly techniques required for tank production forged a workforce with unrivaled skill in complex systems integration. By 1944, the ethos of the company was set in iron. They had spent 40 years building machines for customers who could not accept failure. But as the forges cooled in 1945, the horizon shifted. The nation stood on the threshold of the most ambitious infrastructure project in human history. The safety of the rails was ending. The era of asphalt was beginning, and for a company built on iron wheels, the transition to rubber tires would require more than just engineering. It would require a total reinvention of their soul. By 1945, the American landscape was shifting underfoot. The century-long dominance of the iron rail was waning. The era of asphalt was beginning. Pacific Car and Foundry, an entity built on the back of the locomotive in the tank, saw the writing on the wall. If commerce was moving from the track to the highway, they would not simply follow it, they intended to carry it. But they did not start from scratch. In 1945, Pacific Car made a decisive gamble, acquiring the Kenworth Motor Truck Company of Seattle. This was not a leveraged buyout. It was a cash purchase, financed entirely by the war chest accumulated from building Sherman tanks and Liberty ships. Kenworth was the spiritual twin of Pacific Car. Founded in 1923, they did not build vehicles for the casual delivery route. They built hand-assembled, over-engineered beasts designed for the mud of the timber camps and the grades of the Cascades. They were a low-volume, high-margin outfit that understood a fundamental truth. For a logger or a heavy hauler, a truck is not an asset. It is a lifeline. This acquisition gave Pacific Car a turnkey entry into the heavy-duty market, but they were not content with a single champion. 13 years later, in 1958, they executed the second half of a masterstroke, the acquisition of Peterbilt Motors Company. If Kenworth was the rugged brawler of the Pacific Northwest, Peterbilt was the polished aristocrat of the California highway. Operating out of Oakland, Peterbilt had cultivated a reputation for meticulous craftsmanship. These were trucks for the owner-operator, who viewed his rig as a personal statement. They featured custom paint, extensive brightwork, and an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. This is where Pacific Car defied the gravity of American capitalism. Conventional business wisdom dictates consolidation. Merge the companies, standardize the parts, fire the redundant engineers, and dilute the identity to cut costs. Pacific Car did the opposite. They sanctioned a civil war. Management understood that the value of these companies lay in their distinct cultures. They deliberately kept Kenworth and Peterbilt separate. Separate engineering teams, separate dealer networks, separate design languages. The bug of Peterbilt and the Kenworth Key were allowed to compete against each other for the same customers. This internal friction generated heat, and heat generates energy. The engineering teams at Kenworth pushed for greater ruggedness and serviceability, creating trucks that could be fixed with a wrench in the middle of a blizzard. Simultaneously, Peterbilt engineers chased aerodynamic refinement and driver comfort, turning the cab into a command center. By the late 1950s, this dual-brand strategy had secured Pacific Car's stranglehold on the premium market. Together, they controlled nearly 60% of the custom-built truck segment. But more importantly, they had created tribalism. Drivers didn't just buy these trucks, they swore allegiance to them. You were a Kenworth man or you were a Peterbilt man, and the debate over which was greater generated a loyalty that no amount of advertising budget could buy. Price became secondary to pride. Pacific Car had successfully pivoted from the rigid schedule of the railway to the open chaos of the highway. But the boardroom strategy was about to collide with a cultural revolution. The truck was ceasing to be a mere machine and becoming an American icon. The golden age of the king of the road was about to begin. Before the regulatory landscape shifted, PACCAR had already forged the weapons that would define the next generation of trucking. The 1960s saw the arrival of two machines that would cease to be mere vehicles and become American cultural icons. The first was the Kenworth W900, introduced in 1961, but perfected with the A model in 1965. It defined the archetype of the long nose. It featured a flat, vertical wall of chrome pushing through the wind and a hood long enough to land a plane on. But its beauty was functional. Under that hood lay a mechanic's sanctuary. The engine bay was vast, designed to accommodate the massive big cam Cummins or Caterpillar diesels of the era without cramping the wrench. It was built to be worked on, and it was built to work. Then in 1967 came the Peterbilt 359. If the Kenworth was the workhorse, the 359 was the thoroughbred. It was the Corvette of diesel, with its distinctive dual-round headlights, separate fenders, and a dashboard laden with aircraft-style gauges. It appealed to a different instinct. It wasn't just about hauling freight, it was about looking good doing it. The 359 didn't just have a driver, it had a pilot. These two machines sat ready, waiting for the spark that would turn them from industrial tools into symbols of freedom. That spark struck in 1980. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 kicked the doors of the industry off their hinges. Deregulation shattered the old monopolies and gave birth to the owner-operator. Suddenly, a driver didn't have to work for a company. He could be the company. For these new entrepreneurs, the truck was their office, their home, and their business card. They didn't want the cheapest truck. They wanted the truck that said, "I have arrived." They flocked to PACCAR. The rivalry between Kenworth and Peterbilt became tribal. At truck stops from Nebraska to New Mexico, the debate over the W9 versus the 359 was argued with the fervor of religious dogma. But success breeds distinct threats. In 1981, Daimler-Benz acquired Freightliner and declared a new kind of war. Freightliner weaponized volume. They introduced the concept of the fleet truck, aerodynamic, standardized, constructed with more plastic and less steel, and sold at a price point PACCAR refused to match. The market threatened to commoditize. The question facing PACCAR was existential. Do we chase the bottom dollar, or do we hold the high ground? PACCAR chose the high ground. They doubled down on customization. While Freightliner was stamping out cookie-cutter clones, PACCAR allowed drivers to spec every bolt, gauge, and gear ratio. They bet that there would always be men willing to pay for steel. Simultaneously, PACCAR took this philosophy of hard metal to the ends of the earth. In Australia, they faced a geography that destroyed lesser machines. The road train, 3 or 4 trailers hauled by a single prime mover across the unpaved heat pans of the outback, required cooling capacity that standard trucks simply did not possess. PACCAR didn't just export American trucks, they re-engineered them, lifting the radiators and reinforcing the chassis to survive thermal shock and brutal vibration. In Canada, the challenge was inverted. In the Yukon, steel turns brittle and diesel turns to gel. PACCAR's engineers developed Arctic packages, insulating batteries and heating fuel lines to ensure that when a logger turned the key at 30 degrees below zero, the machine answered. PACCAR had successfully defended its fortress in America, but the business of freight knows no borders. By 1989, the Berlin Wall was crumbling and a new map was being drawn. To survive the 90s, PACCAR would have to leave the safety of the interstate and invade the old world. When the Iron Curtain fell in 1989, it didn't just liberate nations, it unlocked a continent. The 1990s signaled the dawn of true globalism, and for a company like PACCAR, this presented an existential test. They dominated the North American highway, but the old world was a fortress they had yet to breach. The problem was physics. The American longnose, the pride of Kenworth and Peterbilt, was a dinosaur in Europe. You could not drive a 19-foot hood through the medieval alleys of Prague or the tight switchbacks of the Austrian Alps. Europe was a different battlefield. Here, the enemy wasn't the distance, it was the density. European regulations strangled truck dimensions, forcing manufacturers to push the driver forward, sitting directly on top of the engine. This cab-over design required a completely different engineering philosophy: compact packaging, advanced fuel efficiency, and highly sophisticated transmission systems designed for stop-and-go urban warfare rather than open desert cruising. PACCAR knew they couldn't just export their way into this market. To win Europe, they had to become European. The strategy was not to invent, but to acquire, and in 1996 they spotted a wounded giant. DAF Trucks of Eindhoven, Netherlands, was a technological jewel. They possessed some of the most advanced diesel engine technology on the planet, yet they had recently emerged from a crushing bankruptcy. PACCAR saw what others missed. DAF wasn't broken, it was just broke. For $543 million, PACCAR acquired DAF. But crucially, they did not attempt to colonize it. They did not force American steel into Dutch molds. Instead, they injected financial discipline into DAF's operation while leaving the Dutch engineering culture intact. They let DAF be DAF. The gamble paid off immediately. DAF gave PACCAR a foothold in the European Union and access to advanced small block engine technology that would later prove critical for meeting global emissions standards. 2 years later, in 1998, PACCAR completed the pincer movement. They acquired Leyland Trucks in Great Britain for approximately $80 million. While DAF secured the continent, Leyland held the keys to the Commonwealth. To sell in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and India, you need the wheel on the right. Leyland brought deep expertise in right-hand drive chassis geometry, complex engineering regarding steering linkages and visibility that PACCAR hadn't needed in the US. To fund this empire building, PACCAR demonstrated ruthless focus. In 1997, they sold Trico Industries, a profitable oil equipment manufacturer. They shed the peripheral assets to double down on their core competency. They were selling pumps to buy trucks. By the end of the millennium, the strategy was vindicated. PACCAR was no longer just a Seattle company. They controlled the premium market in America with Kenworth and Peterbilt. They commanded the European highways with DAF, and they held the Commonwealth with Leyland. The sun effectively never set on the PACCAR empire, but despite this global dominance, there was a fatal flaw in the armor. They controlled the chassis, the cab, and the brand, but they were still renting the heart. To truly rule the road, they would need to do the one thing they had never done: build the fire themselves. For 100 years, PACCAR built the body, but they rented the soul. By the early 2000s, a dangerous fault line had formed in the company's foundation. They controlled the chassis, the cab, the suspension, and the aerodynamics of the world's finest trucks. But the heart of the machine, the engine, still belonged to outsiders. Whether it was Cummins or Caterpillar, PACCAR was ultimately at the mercy of their suppliers' research timelines, their pricing, and their failures. If a supplier sneezed, Kenworth caught a cold. For a company obsessed with control, this dependency was intolerable. The decision to sever these ties and build a proprietary engine was the most ambitious engineering pivot in the company's history. As Mark Pigott later described it, this was an amazing 25-year tour. This was not a quarterly pivot, it was a generational siege. To build a chassis is to master structure. To build an engine is to master the physics of explosion. It requires metallurgy capable of withstanding 2,500 bar of rail pressure and computer timing precise to the microsecond. It is a discipline where a variance of 1,000th of an inch is the difference between a million-mile workhorse and a catastrophic failure. The depth of their commitment was tested in 2007. PACCAR broke ground on a massive $400 million engine manufacturing facility in Columbus, Mississippi. They did this at the exact moment the global financial system began to melt down. While the rest of the industrial world hoarded cash and shuttered factories, PACCAR poured concrete. They were betting on the future when everyone else was trying to survive the present. The bet paid off. When the PACCAR MX engine series launched in North America in 2010, it changed the equation. The MX wasn't just an engine, it was the closing of the loop. For the first time, the engine and the chassis were speaking the same language. The integration allowed for optimization that third-party suppliers simply couldn't match. By 2024, the majority of new Kenworth and Peterbilt trucks were leaving the factory with PACCAR iron between the frame rails. They had successfully vertically integrated the most complex component of the vehicle, capturing the profit margin and the quality control that had previously leaked out of the building. But even as they mastered the diesel engine, the definition of fuel began to change. The internal combustion engine, the undisputed king of the 20th century, was no longer the only piece on the chessboard. Environmental mandates and the rise of electric propulsion threatened to render the diesel cycle obsolete. PACCAR's response to the electric revolution was characteristically grounded. They did not deal in science fiction, stock hype, or CGI renders. They dealt in physics. They understood that for a local delivery truck, a battery makes sense. So they built the Kenworth T680E and Peterbilt electric variants, quiet, torque-heavy machines for the urban sprawl. But they also recognized the limitations of lithium-ion. You cannot haul 80,000 pounds across the Rocky Mountains on batteries alone. The weight penalty is chemically insurmountable. So they turned to hydrogen. Partnering with Toyota, they began effective development on fuel cell powertrains, replacing the violent explosion of diesel with the chemical silence of hydrogen. From the steam donkey of 1905 to the hydrogen fuel cell of 2024, the technology has changed, but the survival instinct has remained granite solid. But how does a company navigate 120 years of chaos without a single bankruptcy? The answer isn't in the grease or the gears, it's in the bank account. In a volatile world of heavy industry, longevity is the exception. Dominance is an anomaly. But PACCAR is not just a survivor, it is a statistical impossibility. As of 2025, PACCAR has achieved a record that defies the natural laws of business: 86 consecutive years of net profit. Let that sink in. They haven't posted a loss since 1939. They stayed in the black through the inferno of World War II, the crushing stagnation of the 1970s, the deregulation of the 80s, the dot-com crash, and the global pandemics of the 21st century. The feat is absurd when you consider the brutality of their arena. The truck business is a cruel roller coaster. It is a graveyard of famous names, legendary badges that chased growth, over-leveraged themselves, and vanished when the winds changed. PACCAR played a different game. This empire was not built on flash or hype or the quarterly demands of Wall Street. It was built on the PACCAR way, a philosophy established by William Piggott in 1905 and held sacred by every generation since. It is a philosophy of extreme discipline. When the market is booming and competitors are borrowing cheap money to expand, PACCAR pulls back. They treat debt like a disease. They build a war chest that allows them to hunt when others are hiding. Take the Great Recession of 2008. This was the stress test that broke the back of the automotive world. Giants like General Motors and Chrysler collapsed. Competitors in the trucking sector bled billions and slashed their workforces. In that same year, amidst the economic apocalypse, PACCAR posted a profit of $1.02 billion. While their oldest rivals were begging governments for bailouts to keep the lights on, PACCAR didn't even blink. This discipline buys them something more valuable than a stock price. It buys them independence. It bought them the freedom to spend 25 years perfecting the MX engine when critics said it was too expensive. It gave them the power to keep Kenworth and Peterbilt separate when consultants said to merge them. It allowed them to ignore the trends and double down on quality. They are the quiet architects of momentum. They do not seek the spotlight. You will rarely see them on the news cycle. They prefer to let the machines do the talking. From the mud of the Pacific Northwest logging camps to the high-tech autobahns of Europe, PACCAR has proven that while technologies fade and economies crash, integrity is the only currency that never devalues. They are the spine of the modern world, and as long as civilization needs to move, PACCAR will be there to carry the weight.